Just tell me when we like. That's good. Come this way.
Can't make it work. Can't make it. Tried it 3 times.
I don't know why you keep trying it.
Okay, Roland, everything is up.
It's like maybe I'm swimming.
Give it a countdown and whenever you're ready.
Alrighty. Hey folks, Roland Martin here, broadcasting live from Greensboro, North Carolina, on the campus of North Carolina A&T, where today I gave the keynote address at the breakfast this morning for the 60th anniversary of the A&T 4, the sit-in that took place here in Greensboro that spread like wildfire all across the South, integrating lunch counters. And so 2 of the surviving members of the A&T 4, they were at the breakfast, and so certainly glad to speak to the students and alumni here. Right now, though, about to have a conversation with Bob Brown. Bob is a civil rights pioneer, legend, has done all kinds of different things. Was a close associate of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., but also, after his work with Dr. King, went to work for President Nixon. We're going to talk about that. Also, his relationship with Nelson Mandela, which he covers in his book, You Can't Go Wrong Doing Right, How a Child of Poverty Rose to the White House and Helped Change the World. Bob Brown, how you doing, man?
Doing fantastic, Roland.
Glad to have you here, man.
Good to be here.
So let's talk about, first of all, it brings back memories for you being back on this campus.
Absolutely. My second year of college was here at A&T, and I didn't live on campus. I lived in High Point, which is like 15 miles away.
That's where you were born and raised?
That's where I was born and raised. I came back home. My grandparents who raised me were ill, and I left Virginia Union, came back here, and I would come to school. I'd either get on a old bus, Trailways bus, and it would cost about 50 cents to get over here. So I'd get on a bus and come to school, or I would get on the highway and thumb a ride. And almost
Every day?
Every day. That's what I did for a year. And I was a member of the ROTC here. I majored in history and economics, and it was a great year. It was a great year in my life. So,
and of course, you came here because you first went to Virginia Union, but right, because of finances, you had to come back home.
That's right. And my grandparents both were ill, and they needed help, and so I decided to come back home and go to school and get here the best I could every day.
What is interesting about reading this book, was interesting about your life, is that, I mean, all these things happened, and it was your grandmother and grandfather who raised you, and your grandmother made it perfectly clear that if you help others, God will always take care of you.
She told me that so many times. It was unbelievable. And when I was growing up as just a little boy, she would tell me, she said, Bobby, go to school, learn all you can, and do the right thing, because you can't go wrong doing right. She said, always do the right thing. I heard that all of the time that my grandmother was living, and she lived a long time. She lived to see me go into business. She lived to see me be a federal agent. She lived to see me go in the White House. In fact, I brought her to the White House one evening and let her sit in the Oval Office in the president's chair. Her father was a slave, by the way,
right,
in eastern North Carolina, in Anson County.
So you talk about that, and that was this one particular part of the book where you talked about, and I highlighted it, and you talked about what that felt like and how just you thinking about how your grandmother's dad was treated and how he was beaten. and you talk about when you would see a tree and a limb was hanging,
That's right.
it would automatically bring back this thought of lynchings.
That's right. And it's always been there. It's still that way for me. I know when you're going through the back country of South Carolina or North Carolina, they have all these trees down in Georgia where the limbs grow outward this way, big trees. You can go down the highway, you see them. You go through the back country on the back roads, and they're everywhere. But every time that I see one, even now, it just brings something over me because I know that that's where they hung a lot of people. And they used to show it in the newspapers, in the black newspapers, the Afro, the Journal and Guide, all those papers. When I was a kid, I read every paper. I still read lots of papers every day. I read New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, all those papers. And I read all the black papers. But then I could go in the library at my school, and I would just sit in there and at lunchtime mainly, and just go through the papers, and read papers over and over again. And the pictures would be in there. They would be in the Afro. They'd be in the Journal and Guide.
Now, see, that's interesting you talk about that, because I've had people who have said that we shouldn't show any of the videos of African Americans being mistreated or somebody has been shot. Folks talk about how it triggers them. But to your point, black newspapers, they wanted black folks to know how African Americans were being lynched. They would not let that thing get covered up or go away. Their whole point was, no. We're going to show what y'all did to our people.
Well, there was no other way for us to see it. I mean, there was no television.
And the mainstream papers ignore.
And the main papers never put anything like that in
Right.
the main papers. But the black newspapers and little black periodicals and so forth, they would have pictures of black people hanging from a tree. And as a little boy, it really disturbed me. And it's something that I think about even now.
But when you say it disturbed you, was it also important that by showing it, it was a real reminder
It was
to
always,
you?
It was always a reminder. It's still a reminder. There's no time when I'm driving through the back country of North Carolina, all of South Carolina, or Mississippi, or Alabama, where they have those kind of trees all over the place, that I don't think about it. No time, even now. I mean, I can be riding, and as I did on many times when I worked at the White House and when I worked at other places, where there would be security driving me, policemen or agents or something else, or even when I was a federal agent. Those years I worked as a federal agent, where I was very heavily armed, and if I were going through the back countries of Virginia or somewhere else, South Carolina or North Carolina, where I saw those trees, it always came over me. There was never a time when it didn't come over me. Even now, if I'm going through that, it's something that I think about. I can't get rid of it.
You write in your book that your wife, who, Jesus, you met her in what grade?
I met her. She was my girlfriend from the 5th grade.
5th grade. Y'all been married for how long?
We were married for 47 years.
Right.
She passed away several years ago, but she was the joy of my life.
From the 5th grade, you knew she the one.
She was the one. The 5th grade. And from then on, I used to walk her home from school, from the grade school. I'd carry her books for her and that sort of thing. And then we were in high school together, too. We graduated from high school together. And after we graduated from high school, she went to Hampton. I went to Virginia Union. And she went to Hampton because she could be closer to me when I was at Virginia Union.
But you wrote that when you would see those trees and she would see the look come over your face,
right.
she would tell you, "Let it go, Bob. Let it go."
She said, "Robert, let it go." She called me Robert.
Uh-huh.
She said, "Robert, let it go. Don't think about that. Don't think about that anymore."
Do you believe that African Americans today should have those things etched in our minds? Do you think that when we think today of that Philando Castile video, when we think about other videos, that because we see it and it's etched in our mind, that for this generation it serves the same purpose of that Emmett Till photo, that in those moments where we think everything is great, all of a sudden that thought says, don't forget what happened to this brother or this sister?
Well, I would not wish that any of the young people today would have it on their mind and sketching in their minds like I did, because it's something that it never leaves you, and it worries you. You can be in a meeting in New York or London or Paris or somewhere with some of the top business people in the world or government officials, and somehow or another, some of that stuff comes over your mind. Mm-hmm. It's been an unusual thing for me in my life.
When you think back, the work you were involved in, you talked about leaving Virginia Union, coming here North Carolina A&T, leaving here, then you becoming a police officer, moving back to your hometown, and then all of a sudden going to New York, working as a federal agent undercover. But then you had the nerve to actually come back to North Carolina and say, I'm going to be a black man and open a PR business. What in the world were you thinking?
Well, that's what everybody was saying, you know. My family, my late wife, she said, but I read this book, Effective Public Relations by Scott Cutler. We were in New York one day, down in the Village, and they have all these books down there on Saturdays, and I saw this book. I said, I don't know what this public relations thing is all about. Mm-hmm. So I bought it, and it only cost, I think, 50 cents, because they have these books on sale. And so I got the book, and I read it, and I read it again, and I read it again. And my late wife says, Robert, why you keep reading that book? You read it 2 or 3 times already. I said, this is something that's very interesting to me. It's exciting. It's something I think I could do with my life. And so after I read it one more time, I started making notes about what I would do if I were in the public relations business. And then I went over it with my wife, and she said, oh, I think you could do all of that. And then one day I told her, I said, you know, we're going to move. I'm going to resign my job as a federal agent. There were only just a handful of blacks in those kind of jobs in America during that time. And I said, I'm going to resign my job, and we're going to move back to High Point. And she looked at me like I was lost my cotton picking mind.
Because y'all had left here, and you're gone to New York City.
Yeah.
And she just loved the museums and
she
all
loved the Broadway,
all of that.
everything.
And she looked at you saying, you trying to go back to High Point, North Carolina.
But High Point was still, the South was still very much segregated.
Right.
I mean, we couldn't go in a restaurant. When I went back in 1961, the end of 1960, I mean, it was just totally segregated. And she said, oh no, I'm not going back. So I had to massage her and convince her that this, I felt, was my life's work, that I needed to do this. I had to do this. To survive, I needed to do this.
You had to do some serious begging and pleading.
Oh, I did. I did some shit begging and pleading. I did. So anyway, she relented. We packed up everything, moved back to North Carolina, moved in with her mother. Her mother was living by herself. And, you know, I started doing all this work on trying to create a public relations business. And everybody thought I was crazy. And then they really thought I was crazy when I rented an office in the black area up over an abandoned theater. The theater was abandoned. There'd been a black theater, but the guy went out of business. So there was some little rooms on top there. You could go to a private stairway. And I rented a room up there. And I didn't have anything, no furniture, anything. So I opened one of the doors in that building, and they had a little desk in there, and a table and chair and this. So I asked the guy, could I use it? He said, oh yeah, just do anything you want. Because it was abandoned. So I did that, cleaned up everything, polished up everything, and put me a telephone in there. And all of a sudden, I'm in business. And people call me crazy. The guys on the block, you know, I was up on Washington Street right in the middle of the black community. And they were laughing at me. I was a joke. They said, oh man, that guy's crazy. He leaves New York City, you know, where you can go in a restaurant, where you can go in a theater, you can do anything you want to, and come back down here. You can't even go downtown and get a hot dog.
So they were trying to sit here and leave. You all of a sudden coming back.
I'm coming back.
But when you were in New York, though, you came across Robert F. Kennedy.
I came across Robert F. Kennedy. In fact, he was the chief counsel of the Senate Rackets Committee under Senator John McClellan, and he was investigating the mafia. And so he wanted to interface with the Bureau to see how a case would be made on the mafia. And the district supervisor says, oh yeah, we have an agent here who's really a top guy, and he has some big time cases, and you guys come on up here. So he came to New York, and I sat down and talked to introduce him to him. I talked to him, and then he and his security team were on surveillance of me the night I went out and made a case on one of the mafia guys.
You said that was your, you were very well protected that night.
That night I was very well, there was security everywhere.